have enough time. Thank you guys for coming. Russell's not able to be here today. I want to just give a brief introduction to our speaker, Bray Patrick-Lake, who's here joining us, coming today from Boulder, Colorado. So obviously there's a lot of things going over there with the flooding, so we're thankful that she's here and able to make it. Bray is the Director of Stakeholder Engagement within the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITI, and really a lot of the work she'll be telling us about that she's been working on, I think, is going to be hugely helpful to folks here at DCRI and across the Duke campus. When I thought about inviting Bray here to speak was because she has been part of an internal Duke committee reviewing some of the PCORI grants that are going out, and she has been giving feedback, obviously, related to kind of patient and stakeholder engagement. And when I read one of her reviews of one of the grants coming by, I was like, oh my goodness, there's so much that we need to be learning and that we could be incorporating into our grants going forward. And so I wanted to just have her kind of talk a little bit about the stuff that's going on within CITI and things kind of in the larger patient and stakeholder engagement community, and really to get us thinking as a community about how we can do a better job of bringing patients into our research. You know, in terms of the outcomes that we're looking at, the types of research that we're doing, and where to go with it. And so I'm going to turn it over to Bray, and hopefully we'll have some good discussions today.
Thank you. So I'm Bray Patrick-Lake, and as Jillian mentioned, I serve as the Director of Stakeholder Engagement for the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. But probably most importantly, I come from the patient advocacy background. So I am a patient with ongoing chronic health conditions, both congenital and otherwise, that have really left me needing scientific information that doesn't exist. And so I got involved in patient advocacy basically because I was looking for treatments that hadn't been developed yet. I was trying to navigate deciding which therapy I needed, looking at clinical research, all of which was foreign to me at the time. And I started becoming more and more knowledgeable about these issues, just trying to seek care on behalf of myself. And so once I did that, then I started really getting more involved in the larger issues, so what it means to be a patient. How do we get information? What do we do with it? I was in a clinical trial that was an investigational device study that ultimately was aborted because the trial didn't enroll. If you looked at the study protocol, I would tell you that I had to be crazy at the time to actually enroll in this protocol because I was completely desperate and out of options. In the end, a lot of money and time was wasted and patients got no answers. And I also have an implanted cardiac device from that study that's part of my body forever, or at least until it's removed, that I know very little about. And so I started getting more involved in just trying to work out some of the more systemic issues, because I don't think that the issues in my study were particularly isolated. And I began serving as a patient rep at FDA in 2009, and I started from the perspective of where's my product? Why can't I have this? And then when I really started to learn more about it, I began to really understand it's a complex process. I think at the time, and I have a master's in science, I actually thought that FDA and NIH did all the research. I didn't understand that academic health centers were really directly involved or involved with industry at all. And I went on kind of this entire journey of being a patient and trying to get involved and figure out how we could make this better. And so through the FDA program, I ended up serving as a patient representative for the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. And I was there as a volunteer for quite a while, and then I transitioned to a staff member. So Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative is a public-private partnership that was formed in 2007, which is hosted by Duke University, and all the stakeholders involved. So it's a multi-stakeholder collaboration that has patients, academia, industry, clinical research organizations all coming together to solve problems throughout the clinical trials enterprise. And so the mission is to identify and promote practices that will increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. No shortage of work in that area. And we have a vision for a high-quality clinical trial system that's patient-centered and efficient, enabling reliable and timely access to evidence-based prevention and treatment options. So that's our dream. It's not quite world peace, but it's close, and I think that we can actually achieve that. So here's why CITI was formed. For those of you that are working in the clinical trial space, you'll understand that things are taking longer and longer. We're spending more money. We seem to be getting less answers. And a lot of investigators are pulling out of research. So for those of you that have stayed in it, the patients, all I can say is thank you. We really are glad that you've decided to stick around. Hopefully together we can make some improvements that's going to meet all of our needs. We've seen an increasing need for reliable evidence. There's a lot of data out there. We're trying to sort out what we do with it. How do we make it useful in answering questions? We also know that there are a lot of practical issues related to insurance and reimbursement, national coverage determinations that are being made, and it just seems like we're constantly needing more and better information. So the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, obviously we have transformation in our name. So we would like to do some more transformational improvements to the system, but those are harder, they take longer to shape, it requires bringing more groups together. And so while we're working on those, we also do incremental improvements through our variety of projects, which I'm not going to get too much into our projects, but you're welcome to visit our website and read about. I think we have 14 different projects that are going on right now. And then we also consider portfolio improvements to clinical trials. And we're trying to meet public health needs, and there's finite resources. So I think we really need to get a lot smarter about where we're doing research, how we're spending those dollars, and what we're getting out of it in the end. So our organization is comprised of 4 basic groups. So we have our executive committee, which is our thought leader body. Dr. Califf serves as our executive co-chair, our executive committee co-chair in partnership with Rachel Sherman from FDA Office of Medical Policy in Cedar. Our steering committee is kind of our workhorse body, and so that's where we have groups that have joined. You get to put a representative onto our steering committee, and they get involved in projects. They do help us with some of the strategy, but really they move our projects forward and help us get a lot of this work done and help us decide what's important to the different stakeholders in the enterprise. And then I want to speak to you more specifically about the Patient Leadership Council. So we actually have a thought leader body of patients, 18 of them in fact, that are coming together with our 65 member organizations to try to improve the quality and efficiency of clinical trials, and we're working hand in hand together. So at Citi, patients have been part of the organization from its inception. They've always served on the executive committee and the steering committee, but with the advent of the Patient Leadership Council, we're really taking that to the next level. Eating her lunch in the audience today, we have Dr. Judy Kramer, who was our founding executive director for Citi. And Judy's been a champion of patients, and she's really had the foresight to know the value that patients bring to the organization. And so I do give Judy a lot of credit for making sure that patients had a seat at the table, and not just a seat, that they actually were involved in all the activities that were going on in a meaningful way. So in January of this year, we launched our Patient Leadership Council, which basically brought together the key opinion leaders and thought leaders from the patient advocacy space who are working around clinical trials. And it helped form a collective voice with those folks so they can help us affect this change. At Citi, we might do a lot of research around certain areas. Sometimes we would say we would do research and research or how we're going to improve systems, but really we need effectors. We need people that are going to take that information back out into the world and promote these practices, implement these practices, and really make the change happen. And we see patients as being very powerful in that. So this slide is intentionally busy. I really wanted to give you just the overview of everything we think patients can do working along the clinical trials enterprise and throughout the research continuum. So they can be involved in developing the study concept. There's a lot of information that comes from unmet need and therapeutic burden. What's it like to be a patient living with a disease? We hope that these kinds of these thoughts are coming from the patient community, not just from their physicians who are having contact with them, but getting back out into the research community so we can really start developing therapies that are and treatments that are very meaningful to the patient community. Secure funding. So this is kind of an interesting thing. Now you find yourselves through AHRQ and PCORI. We need patients as partners. So there is some reality that we do need patients to get involved and help us seek funding. I'll speak to you a little bit later more about research advocacy and how we've been involved in directing dollars through NIH funding and advocating for various diseases. There's some new models emerging where patients are actually, their organizations are actually launching companies that are doing seed funding, or they're spinning off almost drug development companies. And so that's a new area of funding where you'll see patients are getting involved. So we can be involved in preparing the protocol, looking at the study procedure, implementing the study. Patients certainly have a role in recruitment and retention, but I will caution you, don't just think of patient advocates or patient representatives as being valuable in recruiting your study. There are some groups that will no longer actually work with you unless they've been involved all the way across the continuum. So you need to be careful of that, and it's very insulting. You'll see at industry conferences sometimes they'll have a panel on patients as a method of recruiting. Patient representatives see that and they get really upset about it. So I caution you if you think you're going to just use them as a recruitment tool. Something that we've done at Citi is we've done projects around quality by design, and we've had patient advocates that have participated in those workshops along with all the other stakeholders. We've sat down, we've actually gone through protocols, and it's really amazing what patients come up with. They can very rapidly look at your inclusion-exclusion criteria, tell you it's unrealistic, it's too stringent, it's not going to happen. Study's not feasible. There's no way we would do that many procedures. We can't make it to the study location. I'm not taking my child out of school to come participate in your study because your study is going on during hours that are convenient to you and not convenient to my child who's sick and already misses plenty of school. So there are some things that we really need to think of. But, and there are some financial aspects too, and this is more directly related to drug development. Ken Getz has some I love to hear him speak on some of the findings that are coming out of the Tufts Center for Study of Drug Development. He's always got things that are kind of, to me, very realistic in talking about the dollars. So the amendments to an average protocol cost about $500,000, and this is related to phase 3 studies. So each amendment, $500,000. Takes 8 weeks to implement each amendment. And right now we're really struggling. If you look at the time that a protocol, from the inception of the protocol to first patient, first visit, patients are very frustrated with the amount of time that's taking to get these studies off the ground. So while we're waiting for therapies, I want you to put this in context of patients who are experiencing something like Duchenne or Parkinson's, and they're getting worse on a daily basis. So if it takes 8 weeks to implement this amendment that could have been prevented on the front end, that is the difference in somebody being on a vent or breathing on their own. That's the difference of a child who is still walking with assistance and being in a wheelchair. And I think that's where contact with the patient community is going to help you frame some of these things that seem like nonsense when you start looking at the bureaucracy and some of the things that are going on in the enterprise that could have been prevented. So Ken Getz's study, they actually looked at, I think it was close to 3,600 different amendments. And he found that about 40% of those could have been avoided. And so at City, quality by design is really about the absence of errors that matter. So if that's preventable, then that's something that should be easily eliminated if we make sure we get patients to the table. But it's not just any patient. So who are these patients that are going to come and help you sort these problems out? We have a term that's been coined over the last 5 to 10 years, really 5, I would say, emerging trends of research advocacy. And so this is really a layperson who's working to influence clinical, behavioral, and basic science research. Most of these folks are actually seeking not only to change how research is conducted, but also to really have a stake in what research is conducted. When you start looking at, let's say, through City, we have the aggregate analysis of ct.gov. So you start shaking out what's in the portfolio. You take it back to the patient community. You say, these are the types of studies that are being done. These are the types of studies that aren't being done. Patients definitely have opinions about that, and they're very interested in holding the enterprise accountable for what type of research is being done. So not everybody was super excited to see the increasing trend of having patients involved. And there are some legitimate challenges. Sometimes patients can be perceived as being too emotional, not having enough objectivity, having too much of a vested interest, feeling like they might actually disrupt some panels because they don't know how to participate in this type of process. They might delegitimize the peer review process itself. They might bring an agenda. And I think these are things that can all be overcome. And then you can focus more on the benefits of involving research advocates. So if those of you have been working on the bench and you're not having a lot of patient contact, I would encourage you to still have patient contact because it's inspiring. The Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome group, which is Donna Appel out of New York, she has a child that suffers this disease. She's been working tirelessly. Started making visits with basic research scientists, just trying to understand the state of the basic science. And it not only took those scientists and really inspired them to do more, they were able to learn things from direct interactions that then helped them decide what path they were going to take the research and say, if your child is experiencing this, is this important, and head off in that direction. Again, so we can definitely be important in communicating about the study, getting messages out to our patient community. How are we going to get patients involved in research? What are the barriers? Informed consent is a huge, huge issue. If you've ever showed a patient an informed consent form, you'll know that maybe there are better ways to do that. City actually has a project right now around informed consent. So we'll be working on some of those issues around the legalese, but in addition, getting patients information they need in a meaningful way. So that's a huge benefit. Real life perspectives. Real-life perspectives on risks and benefits, it's not something you can read about. And again, I caution you of just taking information from the provider community. Even the nursing community sometimes can miss the true experience of what it's like to live with that disease on a daily basis. And then they can serve as a reminder to the ultimate purpose of biomedical research. Some patient advocates joke, it's not just about your fancy paper, it's really about the benefits to our life, and we want to see direct benefits. So here's what a group did in partnership with the American College of Radiology Network Imaging Network. This group of patient advocates started working with this group to kind of help get their messages out around studies. They took the brochure that you see on the left, which is a bit dry, a bit sterile, kind of cold. What's a contralateral breast? That's a really good question if you're a patient. And then they translated that into something more meaningful for patients. And I think you can see the difference between those two and one that's much more appealing. So I want to speak to you a little bit about the actual birth of this movement and kind of the shift in thinking. So we've seen from the 60s and 70s, people really wanted to get more involved in their own care. They wanted to take greater control. We saw the shift from paternalism to participation. And we've also seen through the health social movements the experience of a disease as a private experience to making it a more public experience. I think breast cancer is really an amazing example of that with Susan G. Komen's work. Or that organization's work, I should say. So research advocacy is actually an embodied health movement. So it's driven by personal understanding of experience of an illness, and it's lay people who come together to challenge science, and they challenge it on multiple levels. And so it could be the diagnosis, the treatment, what's known just about the underlying disease itself. And they're really trying to just make the medical community as it exists more responsive to their concerns. And a key feature of this embodied health movement is collaboration. It can't be done in isolation. So research advocacy is really bringing all the pieces together. And when a research advocate sits down at a table, really their credibility is coming through the direct experience with that disease. And that is something that can't be minimized and it can't be taken away. A patient owns their own experience with that disease. So through the embodied health movements, we've seen increasing politicization, if I can say that, of medical research, and patients have gotten more involved in having some power and influence about how dollars are being directed. And some of you might like that, and some of you might not. But there's a really interesting paper by Rachel Kahn-Best, and it's a sociology paper, but she really wanted to try to quantify the effects that advocacy was actually having around medical research in this country. And she got a pretty good start on it in this paper. But she did find a strong positive correlation between advocacy and increases in funding for diseases. So when you start having those patients who are collective and no longer invisible, they are able to get into congressmen's offices, they are able to get to the NIH, and they're able to start advocating for their disease. And we've seen some shifts in history, particularly through the HIV work, where dollars were directly funneled into one disease because patients made it very visible. Historically, the larger funding increases occurred when the NIH budget was growing. So I think we'll have to see if this model still holds up. It's harder when there are only so many dollars to go around, then you're essentially taking them away from one patient population and giving them to another patient population. So we've had some documented effects of advocacy. They've secured direct benefits. They've reshaped funding distribution. And then they've introduced these metrics that are really kind of dollars per death. So if you've done any type of advocacy, you go to the Hill and then you say, look at how many of us are dying, or look at the cost to the community at large. I think WHO is really good at producing disability type of dollars. And so you go to the Hill armed with that kind of information when you're making your case. And then there's also the part about who's the most deserving. So a couple things that happen with that. It seemed like a really good idea when you started trying to categorize diseases, but then it can cause problems for people who are doing more basic research that might touch a variety of diseases. So I think NIH is really, has taken that into account, and they are successfully working around certain models, but I think advocates, without thinking about what kind of effect it would have focused just on advocating for their disease. And then the other thing is it introduced stigma into the argument. So if somebody is an alcoholic, or if they have an illness that they've caused themselves, you have a problem with this argument when you go and you say, we need more dollars, because if we're looking at the most deserving, are they mothers? Are they a vulnerable population? Are they juveniles? Do we want to help them? You have a harder case to make, and so then you have to shift the argument, and it's not just about the disease and the personal experience of the disease, but you make it a public problem. So now if we don't solve this problem, we as a society, this is going to be a burden to our society. And so you have to really kind of change that argument. So the HIV community, I think, can really be credited with pioneering what's known as research advocacy. We've had patient advocacy around this country for many, many years, but focused more on education. This is the shift to research. So in 1982, that was when the term AIDS was actually established, and technically there were no treatments, no answers. We had a lot of people that were living a very visible illness and dying very visibly, and they started collecting and forming their advocacy groups. ACT UP, namely, I think, is one that's done just an amazing job. They started trying to work through the process with FDA and figure out why they couldn't get access to these treatments, and they've been quite successful. And then in 1989, a big shift happened where they actually started attending a clinical trials working group for AIDS. And that was really what we can historically look back on and say, this was the most credible experience, is getting patients to the table. But that's not necessarily without challenge. So Dr. Anthony Fauci has a couple quotes. He was interviewed by Faster Cures, who did a project around this model, kind of about what happened and how did the HIV community work through this. So they went from a very specific or a very large issue to specifics and focusing on what they could actually do. They started looking at the lack of research and answers that are currently existing and saying, how can we address that? We need funding. Then they were looking at clinical trials and saying, these clinical trials are ridiculous. The patients that need to be in them can't even get in them. And then looking also at the regulatory pathways. So here's an evolution of the HIV activists and what we call becoming expertified, which I'll speak to in just a second. So Iris Long was a biochemist who served as a mentor to a lot of these folks. She was attending their meetings, and basically she's like, what are you doing? You're yelling, you're screaming, you're spinning your wheels. You don't even know what you're talking about. You don't know how the system works. You don't know who's funding what. You don't know how research is done. You don't know anything about statistics or the disease itself. So they took that to heart, and they got really smart, and they started learning. And at the end of it, we have the former FDA commissioner who basically said he was amazingly impressed at what these groups were able to bring to the table when they started participating in regulatory panels and work groups. And so this is what happened. There's a sociologist named Steve Epstein at Northwestern, and he gets credit for coming up with the term expertification. So I mentioned this in my own personal story. You're a layperson. You've just been diagnosed with something. You don't know what it means. And then as you start trying to seek treatments and find answers, particularly people that have children, you will go to the ends of the earth to get these answers and get your child treatment. You have to become expertified. So you need the scientific knowledge. You really need to understand the disease, and then you need to have the skills to participate in the public process. Many advocates are self-taught, but there are also formal training programs. So the ACT UP group was particularly wise about getting their folks together, getting them educated, teaching them how to participate, and giving them a voice that actually had traction. And so there were several successful elements to that model. One was attention. You don't have to do it quite this way, but for those of you that were around, I happened to live in New York in my previous life, and I can tell you it was very visible. There was a lot of theater. There was a lot of civil disobedience. People were chaining themselves to things. They were blocking, I think they blocked the Brooklyn Bridge at one point. I mean, there was a lot going on to shine attention on this disease. Then you really have to have the transformation from disease victim to disease expert, where you start taking a little bit more control and you start becoming more empowered. Unifying the constituency and building community. They were masterful at building community, and we struggle with that today with some groups who aren't able to get on the same page. We have to create the unified constituency. Accountability. They had very specific demands. They followed them up. If you promised them something, you had better deliver, and if not, you're going to hear about it very publicly. And they had great leadership. So they had people like Iris Long who took an interest in this, and then they were willing to champion it and really kind of at a personal sacrifice themselves, where it's no longer about you as a patient living with the disease. It's about you coming together with the community to make a difference for all. So here's a group that's doing it particularly well as far as formal training of research advocates. This is National Breast Cancer Coalition. They're teaching Project LEAD, which is a 4-day course. These are some of the things that they're teaching to groups. Learn the language and the concepts of science. You need to learn how to critically appraise science. So as you guys know, as researchers, sometimes your worst fear is patients are going to be on the review panel. What are they going to say? Are they going to torpedo my application because they completely don't understand it? Project LEAD is really working to overcome that. Really understanding how research decisions are made, how dollars are allocated, what research is going to be done. And then they also, in this particular training program, they give people the skills and the confidence, and they kind of give them the parameter and the framework to get into a room with people. It's very intimidating your first time. You don't know whether you should speak up. When I first started serving on FDA panels, I started keeping notes of all the questions I wanted to ask. And I'd be sitting there going, I shouldn't ask that, because surely everybody knows this except for me. And 90% of those questions would finally get asked by somebody else. So over the years, I started becoming more confident and probably maybe too vocal. But it takes a while, and you don't just find these people on the street. There's definitely things that have to happen to make them effective advocates. So now we've got people who are expertified. What are we going to do with them? They are out on the street. They're actively advocating. Patients are becoming more involved in their own diseases. And so we've seen through AHRQ and PCORI the increasing patient voice. And so how are we going to better incorporate the patient voice into our research? We have a lot of challenges we want to address. So the programs right now are designed to address the challenges of having the limited reliable information that patients want and that help caregivers actually make relevant treatment decisions. Limited application of research to the real-world populations. We're hoping that patients can overcome that. And limited information that patients and caregivers are finding useful. So the proposed solution by AHRQ and PCORI is patient-powered research networks, registries, and clinical trial networks, which you've all been hearing quite a bit about through the Effective Healthcare Program and otherwise. But, what does that mean? So if we're going to have patients that are involved, sometimes it's a bit of a foreign language. And I say this kind of jokingly and not, but a lot of times people don't really understand what patient engagement means at all or how to do it. They might focus on the sign-off, or they might, now we're seeing patients as co-investigators. Well, what does that mean to have a patient group really actually being your partner in research? There are certain challenges around that. So there are a variety of levels of patient engagement. Dr. David Hickam gave a talk earlier this summer at the NINS Inspire workshop, and he had this slide, which I thought was pretty brilliant when you're thinking about your PCORI application. So we want to go from the minimal public involvement over to consultation, to collaboration, to control. And you guys are probably like, well, what? I really don't know what that means. So I thought it would help you, and this is just the Bray Patrick-Lake School of Thinking on patient-powered research and its decision tree. So if we start at the top, was the research an idea of the patient community? No. Have you asked patients what they thought about your research? No. Have you considered being an accountant? Maybe you should. All right, let's back up. Was the research an idea of the patient community? Yes. Great start. Now let's say the patient community didn't come up with the idea. You ask them what that they thought of the research, and then it's a yes. So now you can actually find another sidetrack. So you're not completely off into the forest yet or in the gutter. You can still save this. So you didn't start there, but let's go back to the patient community. What do you think of this research? What do you think of this research agenda? Is this meaningful to you? Would you support this enough to actually get involved or help me have some contact with your patient community? If the answer is yes, then you can proceed to, will it advance science, improve care, and or outcomes? If the answer is yes, you're good to go. If no, you can go back to, please be an accountant. Are patients involved in developing the investigational plan? Again, we hope, yes, patients can bring valuable perspective that can help you solve a lot of these problems across the clinical research enterprise. Are patients serving on the research team and monitoring the conduct and progress of the research? So these are new relationships that you're going to have to figure out how to navigate and how to make meaningful. And so there's some basic groundwork that's already there, but I can tell you there's much work to be done in this area. And this is such an easy one. I can't believe it's overlooked so frequently. Are patients involved in helping you disseminate your study results? It is not enough to publish it in the New England Journal. I think that's great, but patients aren't reading it. So you have your peer community over here, but you really can't neglect this other community about what the research means, how it's going to change care, how it's going to change practice, and the gap that it's going to fill in the research portfolio. So if you did all of these and you made the whole circle, congratulations. Patients need more researchers like you to be our partners in research. So on this slide, I really wanted to focus a bit on some of the questions we can help you with as you're developing your study. And so it's kind of what I would boil down to the so what and who cares. At City, we've gotten in the habit of taking some of our very technical projects and trying to boil them down to a public summary, which is essentially 7 questions. Not all these questions are specifically in here, but you should be able to tell the story of your research. I don't care how technical it is. I don't care if it's basic bench science that you don't know how to interpret. You as people need to figure out how to interpret this and how to tell the story about your research. So why is the study important? Very basic. Who does the study benefit? Very basic. Do patients agree that clinical equipoise exists? Okay, you're going to have to explain what clinical equipoise is, but I think we need to get that buy-in from the patient community, particularly if you want them to enroll in the study. And if they don't agree, then maybe we should be talking to NIH and FDA and saying, hey folks, the patient community doesn't see this as an issue right now, or they think the questions are already answered, or that this is already standard of care. So let's move on from that. But patients can help you sort that problem out. Is your research going to actually make a difference? Is it going to change the standard of care? Rob Califf has certainly done a lot of work around looking at characteristics of different studies and what they actually have to do to make a change. So is your research going to be a meaningful contribution at the end of it to the questions that patients are looking to have answered? Who's the eligible study population? We hear over and over about the study population being too clean because that's really the easiest pathway, and even with that, it's not an easy pathway. But at the end, you'd have to ask, do those results apply to the real-world population? Probably not. So we're really trying to work more around, can we actually have clinical trials that benefit the people that are actually going to be using the therapy? Are there similar trials? So if you get on clinicaltrials.gov, for those of you that use SAS or have some statistical knowledge that I certainly don't have, you can go in the ACT database and you can start playing around with what's in there. Patients get really frustrated when we start seeing multiple studies with small populations, and at the end you go, is that even going to be statistically significant, or is it enough to make a change in care or something meaningful to patients? And a lot of times that's not that's not going to be the end result. So we need to be really careful about our finite resources and how we're spending them. Is it going to fill a gap in research? I don't know. Will patients be interested in enrolling? This is such a basic thing. Please talk to your patient about a study. I was in a study that was double-blinded, randomized with a sham procedure of a right heart cath. When you woke up, you didn't know if you had a device in your heart for a year. It's really not a wonder that most people wouldn't enroll in that study. So some basic things. Is the study feasible? We talked about it early on. Is informed consent readable and clear? You can definitely have patients that have different levels of health literacy and literacy in general. You need to be running these things by them before you launch your study, and then you're going to have to back up and address that later and send it back to your IRB. So let's get that on the front end. And then how are the study results going to be communicated? We really do want to know that. Why should we care about your research if you don't ever share it with us? Patients are now saying, there's a great phrase going around, nothing about us without us. You've heard it for social justice actions. It's coming up in the patient community quite a bit. So we need to be accountable to that community and share your results with them. So I've talked about these people that can help you with some of these issues, but who are these research advocates? Where do I find them? First, I think you have to decide what type of research advocate do you need? What type of activity are you undertaking? So it's different to have an individual patient who can sit down and start talking to people about clinical trials and just kind of being a peer advocate and explaining the research process. Then at a community level, you might need somebody a little more sophisticated to serve on an IRB. They really do need to have some type of understanding of the research process. And then there's the system or policy level. If you need to have more dollars dedicated to your disease, you need to make friends with a patient advocacy group. You need to make friends with somebody that's going to get to the Hill and get in those offices and start saying, hey folks, we need to shine a light on these issues on your behalf. And in partnership with researchers and physicians as well. So the individual patient, I think you can do what's called the clinic conversion for those of you that are actually working in clinics. There are patients that sit down with you and you start telling them kind of the state of the science. And it's, you don't say, really? Well, that's terrible. Why can't I have these answers? So you start with being honest about the state of the science and the current regulatory challenges. Patients really don't know. If we actually went to the store or went to a hospital and could get what we needed, we wouldn't care. It wouldn't be an issue. It's the people that actually go to access some type of therapy and they find out that the field hasn't progressed in 30 years and their child needs treatment now, or I can't have access to this device. Those are the people that are going to make changes for you. And I think that frustration, so your initial reaction for me was shock and dismay. Really? I can't believe it. How do we get this far in medicine? I thought we knew everything. To being frustrated. So you need to look at that as potential energy. Frustration is energy. It can be molded and challenged and channeled into another direction, and you can take those people and you can make them your advocates and your friends and your voice, and help help you solve your problems. So if you're going to do the clinic conversion, though, be careful, because today we know clinic appointments are getting shorter and shorter. If the patient only has X number of minutes and they've got a zillion questions to get through, you need to be mindful. You need to establish up front, hey, I'd love to talk to you about this. Is this okay? If you get the yes, please go on. If you get the no, turn it off. You'll find people do want to talk to you, and they do want to help you, but you're going to have to find another way to connect with them. So I don't know if you're having to email just through electronic health records. At some point, I'm going to go to Duke Jail because I work remote and I don't attend all the trainings and I screw up all these things, so I don't know if you can actually do it. Is it legal to email a patient through your personal email account or your work email account? I don't know, but you need to establish how are we communicating with them so these things aren't all in their medical record if that's what's happening. So they want to convert, they want to change that relationship from just being a patient to I want to get involved with some of these issues. Figure out how you can work together. And I would encourage you to set a coffee or a call with a hard stop. Patients can chat for hours. So have specific goals of the call, identify those, and then work around those expectations. You can also try to connect them with a local chapter that's a support group. But again, support groups can be different. That's really focusing on patients' well-being and emotional needs that are being met. That's different than research. So you can connect them there, but they're still going to need support over here if they become a research advocate. And then you really need to manage their expectations without being a dream stealer. What is it that you can do to help them? Is it getting them connected? Is it giving them basic education? There are some logistical challenges, I think, to that. If you decide to go with a patient advocacy group, that can be very obvious for some of these larger applications, particularly PCORI and ARC. I think you need to look at working with a patient advocacy group, but beware, not one size fits all. So this is a changing landscape. It's developing by day. You've got the folks that are doing the walkathons, the people that are doing just general educational and disease support. Now we've got folks who are actually raising money for research. That's not new, but some of them are doing their own research and setting up their clinical trials networks. And as an investigator, that's a really positive thing. You want to be involved with a group that's doing their own clinical trials. It'd be great if they set up the research infrastructure and then you contracted with them. So stay tuned on this because we are going to be doing some work around the patient advocacy groups at City. So we have a new project that's just launched, Effective Engagement with Patient Groups Around Clinical Trials. We're really hoping to better understand the nature, the scope, the reach, the infrastructure that different groups that are working in the space have, understand how they're engaging with research sponsors, and then identifying those best practices. So there's some good background research right now, but there's not a toolkit. I can have you read an article, but at the end of the day, you're going to go, but now what do I do? Who do I contact? How do I work with them? What system do we get in place? So at City, we'll have some recommendations, and then we're also going to have a toolkit that we can put into hands of folks like you, and we're hoping that at the end of that, the greater collaboration is really going to lead to a more efficient and quality-driven clinical trial system. So in the meantime, in specific relationship to academic health centers working around patient groups, Elaine Gallen, Kata Bond, and then Dr. Califf through Clinical Research Forum have a paper out that I would encourage you all to read. It's a recent paper, Forging Stronger Partnerships Between Academic Health Centers and Patient-Driven Organizations. I sent it, I believe, to Jillian. I don't know if I sent it and you sent it out to the CR group. But anyway, you need to read this paper. So it discusses how you manage expectations. You really need to define your goals. What's the group looking to get out of this? What are you looking to get out of this relationship? And be very honest and direct and candid about that. There's a certain reality to it, and you don't want people to leave feeling that it just wasn't a satisfying interaction. You need to establish your infrastructure and processes. There needs to be a clarity around how costs are going to be shared. If you get a grant together and you're joint funded, what's going to happen? Also, patient groups, we work in real time, we work really fast, and we're really particular about how our dollars are used. And I can tell you indirect cost, when you start hearing about that, it's a foreign concept. So you really have some things you're going to have to explain when you're working with patients as partners. If you're obtaining data, who owns it? Who can access it? How is it going to be shared? Patients are going to want you to share their data. We don't want you to take it and say, I'm sorry, but now it's only for me. We want to make sure that it actually gets out in the community. And then you need to have a timeline and an exit strategy. Is this project going to go in perpetuity? Will it ultimately end? What happens if you're dissatisfied? How are you going to get out of it? So I mentioned patients are going to want you to maximize their participation when they're partnering with you. So you might want to look at patient sharing programs. This is a novel concept really within industry, some of these pre-competitive kind of activities. SysCRIP had a really interesting survey recently about willing but ineligible volunteers. So somebody knocks on the door, they don't fit your study. We actually found that 42% of them walked away, and that was it. We never heard from those patients again. So we already have a shortage of patients participating in research. Anything you can do to maximize that, please help them get connected with another study. Control sharing programs, again, it's emerging in industry. I think we need to look more about how we can do that. Data sharing is an obvious one if you've been following the EMA's work, and there have been a number of panels, including at Citi, on data transparency and sharing. And then I've hit on it several times before, communicating your study results to participants. Here's a model that if you're not aware of this, the Specialized Program of Research Excellence, you can get funding through, I think it's NCI, NINDS, and the other one is the Dental and Craniofacial Research Group at NIH. And there is a group at UCSF that has breast spore. Maybe I would have named it something else if it would have been my project, but anyway. They have patient advocates who actually work on clinical trial issues hand in hand with partners. They are reviewing their protocols, reviewing their informed consent, doing the outreach, helping them with messaging, and they're embedded in an academic health setting. And they're really serving as a bridge between the research community and the patient community. So that's certainly a model that comes with funding, which is a plus. So let's say you've liked my talk so far and you're like, hey, I really do want to go connect with patients. Now how are we going to do it? Largely, you can look at GuideStar or Charity Navigator. I like GuideStar. I read it actually for fun because you can look at everybody's 990s and see what they're doing with your dollars that have been donated. You can look at their research agenda. You can see that they spent X million dollars here. They had a walkathon that raised $80 million and $1 million went to research. So you can read through that and look at different groups and see kind of what their activities are. You can look at scientific meetings, look at FDA panel rosters. They're all public record. Go back if you're looking for a patient who seems to be particularly knowledgeable in an area. Online patient communities are a bit of a crapshoot, but there are patients online. You can lurk. I don't know that I would necessarily join if I was an investigator. You could create, my patients are going to kill me because I manage these online communities, but we know that there are investigators who are following along. Just be careful because you don't want to be identified as an expert who then gets in a position of having to provide some type of medical advice. So social media is a good way to see patients, but you really want to kind of connect that through to some of the larger activities. Health Research Alliance and Faster Cures Train Group. Train Group is their, Faster Cures has a research acceleration and innovation network, and these are some of the more sophisticated patient groups that are coming together with people across the enterprise to help. I don't think they're just specific to drug therapy. I think they're just heavy in the drug area, but drug development issues where they're trying to solve some of these issues with basic research all the way through getting something to market. So you can look at the groups that are participating in those, and certainly the Patient Leadership Council. And once you decide to make that connection, it's still, you know, there's stuff to navigate. And you're not necessarily on eggshells, but it's not always a simple matter. So what if there's more than one group? And what if they don't agree? What if one group thinks the pain issue is coming up right now? Some pain groups feel like they should have access to opioids, others don't. So if you're trying to do research with partners, it can be hard to figure out which voice you should listen to. And I think you can look at the experience of an organization, their experience in research, and kind of decide which one's the best fit for you. Then you really need to figure out how are you going to meaningfully include the patient voice? What if they're not very sophisticated? So are you giving them a seat at the table, but you know you've put somebody into that seat that does not have the skills and knowledge to actually participate in the conversation? It's a pitfall, and it happens all the time. Or did you already do all the work, and now we're at the end of the work, and now we need a patient to sign off on it, so you need a rubber stamper. Who are you going to get? Probably somebody who's actually been doing some research that has a bit of a name, and you want them to sign off on something. Great strategy, but that's not necessarily meaningful inclusion. And then we've seen with the sophistication and the evolution of advocates, what happens when a research advocate actually spends so much time in the research community that they begin losing touch with the patient community. Are they still the best voice for that community? So I think you need to look and see research advocates that still have the reach back, that are still participating, and are not necessarily just professional advocates. There's certainly a role for professional advocates, but the patient community itself might actually reject that person and say, you know what, they're not our best voice. And then on another slide, I had the thing about there is no one size fits all. There is no one size fits all patient. So make sure that if you see a lot of disparity or diversion within the community, that you are finding ways to account for all perspectives as much as possible. So with that said, these research advocates really don't grow on trees. You're actually going to have to do something to help support them and make them knowledgeable if you want them to be at the table with you and participate in a meaningful way. So you can work with patient groups to develop some educational modules. You can serve on their medical advisory board. Just to caution again, go back to GuideStar, see what kind of financial resources they have. They don't have to have a lot, but they need to have enough to cover liability insurance. I don't know at Duke if your insurance actually, professional insurance, covers your outside activities. I have no idea how that works, but you need to check on that. And then you want to make sure that they're operating in an ethical manner. And that can be, through various financial relationships, but you need to do some homework. You can certainly write newsletter articles. This is an easy thing. Again, you should be able to talk about your research in 500 words or less, maybe 1,000. Just talking about what you're working on and how it's meaningful to the patient community. Give outreach talks, organize educational nights. I think Duke is very good at having patients come in, but you can certainly boost those types of activities and make sure that each disease, not just an institution, has representation. There are less formal interactions, just sitting down with patients to have coffee, and I know like cardiology, they do walk with the doc and let's go run together, yada yada. That can actually be quite good for establishing relationships. And again, for our basic scientists, I encourage you to allow people to come into your lab. I know it seems like they might not understand, but the more we can do to get folks into that environment and see the value of basic research, the better. And then lastly, create an institutional research advocacy or patient engagement program. So do we have a general program for advocates that are research advocates that can look at some of the 30,000-foot issues in institutional strategy? If we don't, we should. So how do you continue to support these folks, whether they be individual patients or patient groups? At City, we're actually trying to provide some educational resources. We have a new website that's going to be launching shortly, and this is just a snapshot of one of the pages that will be available soon. And so we're able to walk patients through clinical trial basics, and we were fortunate that Ken Getz, who's written a book called The Gift of Research Participation, helped us with a lot of this content. And then you can navigate the basic learning up a little higher and go to understanding more. So we've got topics around regulatory issues, and you can even do the NIH training module. It's not just for investigators. Other people can do it and learn quite a bit about the research process. And for us all, anybody working in research, we really need us all to come together to promote a culture of research. We really need to make sure that you're raising awareness about research through outreach, making sure, again, that study results are getting communicated back, valuing participation of patients that are in the clinical trials. When they do step forward and they do participate, we need to thank them, and we need to actually make those folks our heroes. We need to keep working on the systemic issues as far as the learning healthcare system and making sure that we have a convergence between clinical practice and research. And then we need your help in creating a culture of every patient in a trial. It shouldn't just be pediatric neurology, it should be all diseases, and we really need to start changing that mindset. So in sum, I do believe, and I hope you do too, that patients are a driving force behind improving the clinical research enterprise. We can work to increase meaningful engagement of patient stakeholders, and they can work on issues that involve quality, efficiency, and certainly portfolio improvements. Meaningful patient engagement takes a lot of effort, and it requires an investment of time and resources. And I will leave with you that there are no shortcuts. So if you want to do this, you're going to have to take action, and you're going to have to make an investment in it. Thank you. There's a mic right here.
Any questions from folks?
It may be two that we're just using. I was asked to repeat any question that comes from the back, so I don't know if we're just using those.
Okay, I actually don't see how to turn it. Oh, there it is. I had a quick question. So I know that you've been involved with the PCORI patient engagement side of things as well. I think both as a reviewer and on some of their panels. And I didn't know how what your experience had been in terms of how you feel they're doing, both from the PCORI side in terms of getting patients involved, and then also as if you were reviewing, kind of as you've seen things come in, and if there's any kind of feedback there.
I am a new reviewer. I'm not reviewing anything that comes out of Duke, just so you know. I'm doing communication and dissemination this time, and I have only received one application as of last night, and I actually haven't read it. So I'm in a good position to just philosophize about nothing that I actually have experience with. They do have an online patient community for the patient stakeholder reviewers where information is being shared. It's a daunting process because we're given all the same tools that you are. It's just that we don't review the technical merit. So we still have to come up with, I think, reviews that are legitimate and based on something. And I think it can't just be opinion. You need to be able to explain why you feel this way, why it's relevant to the patient stakeholder community. I think it's getting better. I mean, just from friends that are investigators, I've heard a bit of frustration in the pilot round where they felt like clearly there was some comment that just seemed a bit off base or not understanding the proposal itself. But I know one of those folks got funded in this round who didn't get funded in the first round. And when they have the public deliberation, so you submit all of your comments and then you come back and you have to be publicly accountable. You have to sit at a table and defend why you wrote what you wrote very publicly, and that the person that you felt or the review comment that was out of place, that person then changed their comment, and you can see that through the process. I believe it's documented.
It's okay, there are microphones on the ceiling. So, from a patient perspective or from an advocate's perspective, one of the questions that has come up for our research group is patients donating samples. Could be blood samples or other types of samples. And the understanding, of course, is that that information would be used for future research purposes. It's not rare that in industry those samples are held for a period of time, and then because of the cost, they might be destroyed. Our position has always been that that violates the trust between the investigator and the patient. But we haven't been able to gain traction when it comes down to millions of dollars that are being spent to save those samples. What is your opinion or position, or is there something that can be done through city to further what I think and many here feel is an important question?
So I think based on the work the city's doing now, it would be informed consent. And what are the expectations of a patient when they sign an informed consent form? And I don't know that this sounds like a specific work stream, but I can certainly take it back to our leadership and let them know that this has come up and it's an issue. But I think understanding what are patients' expectations when they give that sample, what do patients think is happening? Do we think that they're being stored in perpetuity and that we can call on those samples later? Do we think that they're being shared? I think that's an issue. I was in a trial that was an industry-funded trial, and I didn't realize at the time that it talked a lot about what happened with the study, but not what happened if the study was stopped. What happened to my data? Well, when I signed up, I thought my data would be shared to help others if I didn't receive a benefit. I kind of talked myself into it as at least I'm helping other people. And that really isn't true because nobody saw that data. So I think you have to manage the expectations, and you can do maybe some facilitated discussion with patient groups and with industry to see what people actually think on that issue and if they can make a recommendation. Yes?
Do you think that investigators should use crowdfunding to fund their research? And has anyone been able to have success in using that?
So crowdfunding is emerging. I'm trying to think about, I do have a number of crowdfunding resources that I can email you if you get in touch with me later. As far as specific groups, ALS, which group was it? They did I think it was $1 million prize. And so it was a little bit of the crowdfunding model, but it was based on results and not the vehicle. So it was actually, we're only going to pay, for this result. I was on a website recently where you could pop up your research proposal and have people, dial for dollars and basically promise funding. I don't know if anybody's tried it. I'd like to hear, some of these things. I see it's like I only need $5,000. I'm thinking, really? I don't know what you're gonna do for $5,000, but that's great. But I think you have to be creative as a researcher, you know, how are you gonna stay alive these days? I don't think you can look at traditional models solely. I think you're gonna have to change and look at different models. Certainly patient groups, if they're willing to support it and willing to put it out, that'd be a great indication of, you know, what the patient community views as the value of your research. Yes, sir?
Many support groups and patient disease groups have activities to raise funds so that they can distribute research grants.
Yes.
And that's across all domains, whether it's oncology or cardiology. What would you guesstimate right now are the number of or percent of societies of those types of organizations that have patient participation in their research selections?
That's a good one. I don't know, we're about to start the literature review at the city project as far as what's going on in the patient community, so I don't have the data to answer that. I do know that the groups that are funding it, it's a mixed bag. I mean, I feel like some groups are very effective at having the patients be involved. I do know other independent groups where really it's kind of the medical advisors and kind of a club of who's on the medical advisory deciding what gets funding, and I can't speak intelligently to, you know, any statistics around that.
I was doing research in the late 90s when, and I think Judy would remember, ICAC, which was a consortium of all of the companies, the large pharma companies doing HIV drug development. And I think ICAC was a very important thing that happened sort of contemporaneously with ACTA and the uprising of the HIV-affected community and families. So I wonder, in your engagement as a patient and with City, what you think of the potential in other chronic diseases to work in pre-competitive space amongst competitors.
So I have to be, frankly, I'm shocked. One of the diseases that I'm involved with, which is a neurologic community, I mean, they just haven't gotten here. It's not like the model doesn't exist. It's like they're still out, you know, you need to shine a light on my disease. I need some respect for what I suffered. And it's kind of like, okay, folks, that story's gotten really old. What are you going to do? How are you going to transition out? And I think it takes strong leadership, and I also think it takes the unified voice. And I see a lot of groups that are pulling in different directions. And I really don't know, I mean, this AIDS model came about in the 80s, you know? We're significantly past that. That was very effective. I think breast cancer, Parkinson's, cystic fibrosis, you know, diabetes, we're seeing some diseases that are working around these models and creating new models, but yet, if you go on GuideStar, I think there's gonna be about 6,000 different patient groups in this country, and yet when I go to these meetings, there's a good, maybe at best, when PCORI pulls in everybody, there's about 150 of us that, you know, keep coming up at the same meetings as far as sorting out these problems. So what about all these other groups? And I think it takes some reach back, and there's definite competition for resources between groups, and that can certainly be an obstacle. But if you have a patient group that is, you know, emerging and seems interested, connect them, you know, and show them. And a lot of these executive directors are happy to talk about models that work. When I launched the PFO Research Foundation in 2010, first thing I did was call a bunch of executive directors, and nobody said, no, I won't talk to you. They told me how to do it, what I need to do, who I need to connect with. So the information's there, just help groups realize that there are ways to do this.
I have one other quick question. You know, what patients have done, people like you have done with the research enterprise is huge, and it's obviously remedial, and I think it's changing everything. And PCORI is a fabulous illustration of that. But, and you clearly are collecting your interests as taxpayers because you're working with legislators and, you know, people in Congress. At what point do you need to frame yourselves and all of us as consumers and take on the insurance sector?
So I think there are some groups, Patient Advocate Foundation, there are some groups that are working around some of the larger systemic issues and access, you know, to therapies. But disease-based groups, okay, you only have so much bandwidth. So on a daily basis, you're trying to stay in business. You're trying to raise enough money to stay alive. You're trying to meet the needs of patients that are emailing you and saying, my child just got diagnosed with this horrible thing, they're going to die, what do I do? So there's a certain reality to just the business model. And so a lot of these groups that have gotten larger now have the ability, and certainly at the city, the people that are serving on the Patient Leadership Council, their organization is stable enough to dedicate time to come together around some of the 30,000-foot issues. So in insurance and the reimbursement issues, just keep connecting those people because I think it's the groundswell of support for a change that will ultimately make it. But they're going to have to link arms. Nobody has the resources to do it alone.
Well, a huge thanks. I think that this was a great talk, and I think everyone learned a lot. Thank you.